Racist cop confronts black woman until her counter-move reveals she trained the crisis protocols he violated. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Officer Daniel Cross had built his reputation on certainty, the kind that comes from years of memorizing procedures and believing that authority was the same thing as understanding. On a cool weekday morning, beneath the steady glow of fluorescent lights and the soft hum of radios, he stood square to the situation with a posture that said nothing would surprise him. His voice carried calm confidence as he addressed the woman in front of him, Dr. Alana Brooks, who stood composed and still, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes steady, her presence quiet in a way that unsettled him more than any protest could have. Daniel believed the moment favored him. He believed the rules were his shield, and that quoting them would end the conversation before it truly began. He spoke of compliance windows and escalation thresholds as if they were immutable laws of nature, not guidelines written by people he had never met. Around them, the space felt measured in seconds rather than feet, a place where attention narrowed and every breath seemed counted. Alana listened without interruption, her expression neutral, absorbing each word as though she were auditing a lecture she had heard long ago. Daniel mistook her silence for confusion, a familiar assumption that made him lean in verbally, clarifying with precision, citing pages and steps, explaining consequences with the assurance of someone convinced that knowledge flowed in only one direction. The narrator observes that Daniel did not notice the small tells, the way Alana's gaze followed the logic rather than the authority, the way she tracked the order of his claims instead of their tone. He had no reason to suspect anything else. In his experience, certainty ended discussions. Alana's stillness was not hesitation, but calibration, the kind learned through years of teaching others how to respond when pressure rises and decisions matter. Daniel continued, confident that his recitation of crisis protocols would close the gap between command and compliance, unaware that each sentence placed another marker on a map he had never seen. The environment offered no drama, no raised voices, only the quiet friction of assumptions meeting preparation. As Daniel spoke, he invoked a clause he believed was foundational, a phrase he had used countless times, convinced it proved his mastery. Alana's eyes flickered briefly, not in defiance, but in recognition, as though she had spotted a familiar typo in a document that should have been clean. She remained silent, letting the moment stretch, allowing the weight of his certainty to settle. The narrator underscores that this was not a standoff of force, but of understanding, and understanding was about to tip the balance without a single step taken. Daniel finished his explanation and waited, expecting compliance, perhaps even gratitude for his clarity. Instead, Alana drew a measured breath, preparing to respond, not to challenge authority, but to realign the conversation with accuracy. In that pause, the story's axis shifted, because what Daniel believed he knew and what Alana had helped create were not the same thing, and the difference between them would soon become impossible to ignore. The pause after Alana Brooks spoke her first measured sentence did not feel long in minutes, but it stretched in significance, filling the space with a quiet tension that Daniel Cross did not immediately recognize. He had expected resistance or confusion, something familiar that fit neatly within his mental checklist, yet what he encountered instead was precision. Alana did not raise her voice or question his authority. She simply clarified one assumption, gently but firmly, as though correcting a line item in a report. Daniel listened with arms loosely folded, his expression controlled, but something subtle shifted behind his eyes. He repeated his earlier point, slower this time, convinced that repetition would restore order. In his mind, clarity was power, and power always resolved uncertainty. The narrator notes that Daniel had been trained to manage crises by controlling the narrative, by narrowing choices until compliance felt inevitable. Alana, however, widened the frame without announcing it, referencing context rather than command, timing rather than force. She spoke about response sequencing, about why certain steps existed, and why skipping one created risks that were not obvious on the surface. Daniel felt the unfamiliar discomfort of someone hearing his own words reflected back with added depth. He glanced briefly at the laminated guide, clipped near his belt, not because he doubted it, but because he wanted confirmation that the structure he trusted was still intact. Around them, the environment remained calm, almost indifferent, yet Daniel sensed a tension gathering, not from bystanders, but from the situation itself, as if it were listening. Alana continued, explaining that protocols were not designed to win arguments, but to prevent cascading errors when stress narrowed judgment. Her tone remained steady, professional, absent of accusation. Daniel responded by citing a subsection number, confident that numbers would settle the matter. Alana nodded, acknowledging the reference, then pointed out a nuance in its application, something that only appeared during advanced training scenarios. The narrator observes that Daniel had never reached that level, not because he lacked capability, but because the system rarely invited him there. His training emphasized execution, not origin. As Alana spoke, she described decision points, not outcomes, and Daniel began to feel the unsettling realization that he was defending a surface understanding against a deeper framework. He shifted his stance, grounding himself, reminding himself that confidence projected authority. Still, he could not ignore the sense that the ground beneath the conversation was subtly moving. Alana's words were not confrontational, yet they exposed gaps without naming them as such. She referenced exercises designed to test judgment under pressure, exercises Daniel had never been part of, exercises that assumed the person in uniform might be wrong before they realized it. The narrator underscores that this was the moment when certainty began to crack, not loudly, but internally, where it was hardest to defend. Daniel attempted to regain control by summarizing his position, framing it as final. Alana listened again, patient, then calmly asked a single clarifying question, one that reframed the entire sequence he had described. Daniel paused, searching for the correct response, realizing too late that there were multiple answers and only one aligned with the original intent of the system. In that silence, the balance continued to tilt, not through confrontation, but through understanding, as Daniel stood face to face with the limits of what he thought he knew. The question Alana Brooks posed did not demand an immediate answer, yet it lingered with the weight of one, pressing into the quiet space between them. Daniel Cross felt the reflex to respond quickly, to assert certainty before doubt could take hold, but something restrained him. He replayed the sequence in his mind, tracing the steps he had outlined, realizing that the clarity he relied on depended on an assumption he had never examined. He cleared his throat and offered a response that sounded correct, though even to his own ears it felt incomplete. Alana did not correct him outright. Instead, she acknowledged his answer and gently layered another consideration on top of it, explaining how decisions made early in a situation could limit options later, even when each step appeared compliant on paper. The narrator observes that Daniel had always been rewarded for decisiveness, not reflection, and the system around him reinforced that habit. Alana's approach challenged that reward structure without naming it, describing how protocols are designed to slow judgment just enough to prevent irreversible errors. Daniel found himself listening more than speaking, an unfamiliar posture that made him aware of the rhythm of his own breathing. He noticed that Alana never framed her points as personal criticism. She spoke as if discussing weather patterns or traffic flow, neutral forces governed by cause and effect. This neutrality unsettled him because it left no obvious target to push against. He attempted to regain footing by asking when such considerations were formally introduced, expecting to locate the discussion within a standard training timeline. Alana answered calmly, referencing advanced modules reserved for facilitators and evaluators, modules that focused on teaching others how to think rather than what to do. The narrator highlights the subtle shift as Daniel realized he was hearing the architecture behind the rules he followed. He glanced again at his guide, noticing for the first time that certain sections referenced appendices he had never seen. Alana explained that those appendices were not widely distributed, not because they were secret, but because they required a different level of responsibility to interpret. Daniel felt a flicker of defensiveness rise, then fade, replaced by curiosity he did not expect. He asked another question, this one less confrontational, more exploratory, about how those advanced scenarios accounted for real-world pressures. Alana responded with examples drawn from simulations, emphasizing that the goal was not perfection, but adaptability rooted in understanding. The narrator notes that Daniel's posture softened, his shoulders lowering slightly as the conversation shifted from enforcement to examination. He began to recognize that his earlier confidence had been built on repetition rather than comprehension. Alana described how facilitators were trained to observe mistakes without intervening immediately, allowing patterns to emerge before correction, because premature authority could mask deeper issues. Daniel realized that he was now on the other side of that dynamic, being observed without being interrupted. He felt exposed, not in a humiliating way, but in a clarifying one. When he spoke again, his tone carried less certainty and more intention, as he acknowledged a gap he had not known existed. Alana met that acknowledgement with a nod, neither triumphant nor sympathetic, simply confirming that awareness was the first threshold. The narrator underscores that this moment did not resolve the situation, but it redefined it. Daniel was no longer defending a position. He was confronting the limits of his preparation. Alana remained composed, guiding the discussion forward with precision, setting the stage for a revelation that would soon transform understanding into accountability. As the conversation continued, the dynamic subtly shifted from analysis to consequence, though neither Daniel Cross nor Alana Brooks named it aloud. Daniel felt the familiar instinct to reassert authority rise again, not out of hostility, but out of habit, a reflex shaped by years of being expected to conclude interactions decisively. He referenced procedure once more, this time emphasizing responsibility, noting that adherence to protocol protected not only the public, but the integrity of the system itself. Alana listened, her attention focused, then responded by reframing responsibility as stewardship rather than enforcement, explaining that protocols were living frameworks meant to guide judgment, not replace it. The narrator observes that Daniel had never considered the difference, because his role had always been framed as execution, not interpretation. Alana described how crisis frameworks were built to anticipate human error, especially under stress, and how misapplication often came from overconfidence rather than malice. Daniel bristled slightly at the implication, then realized she had not accused him of intent at all. She spoke about patterns she had seen repeatedly during evaluations, where well-trained individuals followed steps flawlessly while missing the purpose behind them. Daniel found himself recalling moments from past incidents when outcomes felt unresolved despite technical compliance. He had dismissed those feelings as unavoidable complexity, never as indicators of deeper misalignment. Alana continued, explaining that advanced facilitators were trained to identify those moments as signals, not failures, opportunities, to recalibrate before escalation occurred. The narrator highlights that Daniel's attention was now fully engaged, his earlier certainty replaced by an uneasy awareness that the conversation was exposing more than procedural gaps. He asked, cautiously, how such misalignment was usually addressed within the system. Alana answered that it depended on transparency, on the willingness to examine actions without defensiveness, and on leadership that valued correction over punishment. Daniel felt the weight of that statement, recognizing how rarely such examination occurred at his level. He glanced around, aware that the environment remained unchanged, yet his internal landscape was shifting. Alana spoke about documentation, about how protocols included built-in review mechanisms that were often overlooked or misunderstood. Daniel realized that he had treated those mechanisms as formalities rather than safeguards. He attempted to reconcile this new perspective with his sense of identity as a competent officer, feeling the tension between pride and growth. The narrator notes that this tension marked the true escalation, not a raised voice or a firm command, but the confrontation between who Daniel believed he was and what the framework actually required. Alana offered no judgment, only clarity, outlining how facilitators were taught to respond when violations stemmed from misinterpretation rather than intent. Daniel asked whether such situations required immediate correction. Alana replied that timing mattered, that premature correction could entrench misunderstanding, while delayed insight could foster accountability. Her words carried the calm authority of experience, not rank. Daniel recognized that the conversation was no longer about the initial situation, but about a broader pattern that included him. He felt exposed again, yet this time the exposure felt purposeful. Alana's gaze remained steady as she concluded that true compliance began with understanding the why, not just the how. The narrator underscores that Daniel stood at a crossroads, whether to retreat into certainty or step forward into awareness. The air felt heavier, not with threat, but with implication, as the groundwork was laid for a revelation that would soon make denial impossible and redefine the meaning of authority within the moment. The moment that followed felt less like a conversation and more like a calibration, as if the air itself were being adjusted to a finer tolerance. Daniel Cross noticed details he had ignored before. The way Alana Brooks listened not just to his words, but to the structure behind them, the sequence, the assumptions layered invisibly beneath each claim. He attempted to reestablish familiar ground by referencing documentation, suggesting that whatever nuances existed, the written protocol remained definitive. Alana acknowledged the importance of documentation, then asked which version he had been issued, her tone neutral, her question precise. Daniel answered without hesitation, naming the version he had memorized, the one reinforced through routine refreshers. Alana nodded slowly, as though confirming a hypothesis rather than receiving new information. The narrator observes that this exchange planted a quiet marker, one Daniel did not yet recognize as significant. Alana explained that protocols evolved through iterations, each revision responding to lessons learned from previous deployments, simulations, and evaluations. She mentioned that certain revisions focused less on procedural steps and more on decision architecture, subtle changes that altered how scenarios were interpreted under pressure. Daniel felt a flicker of irritation at the implication that his version might be incomplete, then dismissed it as unlikely. He had always trusted that updates would be clearly communicated. Alana did not challenge that belief directly. Instead, she asked when Daniel had last received formal instruction beyond standard recertification. He paused, calculating, realizing that his answer measured time in years rather than months. The narrator notes that Daniel had never considered that gap meaningful. Recertification had always felt sufficient. Alana responded by describing how facilitator-led updates were often limited to select groups responsible for training others, not for operational deployment alone. She spoke of workshops where scenarios were dissected, not to assign blame, but to trace decision pathways back to their origins. Daniel listened, uneasy, as the picture grew clearer. He asked why such depth was restricted. Alana explained that it was not restriction but design, that teaching the framework required a different commitment than applying it, because teaching demanded accountability for interpretation. The narrator underscores that this distinction unsettled Daniel more than any critique could have. He realized that he had been enforcing outcomes shaped by assumptions he had never been asked to examine. Alana then referenced a specific clause, one Daniel had cited earlier with confidence, and asked how he understood its intent. Daniel began to answer, then hesitated, recognizing that his explanation relied on repetition rather than reasoning. Alana listened patiently, then described how that clause had been rewritten years earlier to address a recurring misapplication identified during crisis simulations. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as he realized that the wording he knew might not match the original intent. He asked how such changes were communicated. Alana replied that they were embedded within facilitator materials, emphasized during advanced sessions, and reinforced through guided evaluations rather than memos. The narrator highlights that this was the seed of revelation, quietly planted, not yet exposed. Daniel attempted to reconcile this information with his sense of competence, feeling the urge to defend himself, then recognizing that defense would only delay clarity. Alana offered no accusation, only context, explaining that systems often failed not because of bad actors, but because of incomplete transmission of knowledge. Daniel stood with that truth, aware that the ground beneath his certainty was thinning. The conversation had shifted from whether he had followed protocol to whether he had ever been equipped to understand it fully, and that realization hovered, waiting for the moment it would be impossible to ignore. Daniel Cross felt the weight of the realization settle deeper, no longer hovering at the edge of awareness, but pressing into his thoughts with steady insistence. He understood now that the conversation had crossed a threshold, moving beyond hypothetical gaps into something more concrete. Alana Brooks did not rush this moment. She allowed the silence to do its work, knowing that comprehension reached through reflection lasted longer than anything imposed. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter, asking how facilitators identified when a protocol had been violated without intent. Alana replied that they looked for patterns, not incidents, for moments when confidence outpaced comprehension. She explained that during evaluations, facilitators observed not just actions, but reasoning, listening for cues that revealed whether an individual understood the architecture behind the steps. The narrator notes that Daniel felt exposed again, not because he had acted wrongly, but because he recognized himself in the pattern she described. Alana continued, describing how facilitators documented these observations, not to penalize, but to adjust training pathways, ensuring that future decisions aligned with original intent. Daniel asked who reviewed those findings. Alana answered simply that the people who designed the framework did, because accountability began at the source. That answer landed with unexpected gravity. Daniel hesitated, then asked who had designed the specific crisis framework they were discussing. Alana did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked Daniel to recall the clause he had cited earlier, the one he believed was foundational. Daniel recited it again, slower now, aware that the words felt less solid than before. Alana asked where he believed the clause originated. Daniel admitted he did not know, only that it had always been there. The narrator underscores that this admission marked a turning point, as Daniel acknowledged the limits of inherited knowledge. Alana then explained that frameworks were never static, that they were built through iterative design by teams tasked with anticipating not just known risks, but unknown pressures. She described long hours spent mapping decision trees, identifying where misinterpretation could cause harm even when intentions were correct. Daniel listened, struck by the level of foresight required to create such systems. He asked how those teams validated their designs. Alana replied that validation came through teaching, through watching others apply the framework and noting where clarity failed. The narrator highlights that Daniel began to see teaching not as an auxiliary function, but as the crucible where theory met reality. Alana's tone remained even as she described years of refinement, of protocols rewritten not to exert more control, but to guide judgment more responsibly. Daniel felt a growing sense of unease, realizing that he had been enforcing outcomes shaped by decisions made far beyond his field of vision. He asked, carefully, whether facilitators ever intervened directly when violations occurred. Alana answered that intervention depended on context, but that true correction often began with revealing the origin of the rule itself. That statement lingered. Daniel looked at her more closely now, noticing the ease with which she navigated concepts he had only memorized. He asked how she came to know so much about the framework. Alana met his gaze calmly and said that understanding came from responsibility, for being accountable for how others interpreted the rules. The narrator notes that Daniel felt the pieces aligning, not yet forming a complete picture, but enough to sense its shape. He realized that Alana was not merely knowledgeable. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived inside the system at its deepest level. The conversation had shifted irrevocably. Daniel was no longer questioning a colleague or a subject matter expert. He was standing at the edge of a revelation that would redefine his understanding of protocol, authority, and the quiet power behind the rules he thought he knew. The realization Daniel Cross had been circling finally found its center, settling with a clarity that left no room for deflection. He asked one last question, quieter than the others, about how facilitators ensured consistency when frameworks were adopted across agencies with different cultures and pressures. Alana Brooks answered without hesitation, explaining that consistency came from shared foundations, from teaching not just procedures, but the reasoning that shaped them, and from returning repeatedly to the original design principles when confusion surfaced. Daniel listened, then admitted that many of those principles had never been articulated in his training. Alana acknowledged that reality calmly, noting that omission was not uncommon, especially when systems prioritize speed over depth. The narrator observes that Daniel's posture shifted again, this time not from tension, but from acceptance, as he recognized that the conversation had outgrown its initial scope. He asked directly whether the clause they had discussed had been misapplied in his actions. Alana responded carefully, stating that misapplication was rarely about a single moment, but about cumulative interpretation, and that understanding the source of the rule was often the most effective correction. Daniel pressed, asking who determined that source. Alana met his gaze steadily and explained that the determination rested with those responsible for designing, testing, and teaching the framework in the first place. There was no flourish in her words, no dramatic pause, only the quiet confidence of someone stating a fact. Daniel felt the implication register fully now. He asked, almost reflexively, whether she had been involved in that process. Alana did not elevate her tone or change her posture when she answered. She said that she had led the team responsible for developing the crisis framework during its most significant revision, that she had overseen the simulations, authored the facilitator guides, and trained the instructors who disseminated the protocols nationwide. The narrator underscores that the room seemed to contract around that truth, not through spectacle, but through gravity. Daniel absorbed the information slowly, replaying every confident assertion he had made earlier, now aware that each had been directed at the very person who understood the framework at its deepest level. He did not feel embarrassed so much as recalibrated, as if a misaligned instrument had finally been tuned. Alana continued, explaining that her role required her to observe how frameworks were interpreted in the field, to identify where clarity failed, and to engage in conversations exactly like this one, not to assert authority, but to restore alignment. Daniel nodded, recognizing that her earlier questions had not been challenges but diagnostics. He acknowledged that his understanding had been incomplete and that his certainty had masked that gap. Alana accepted the acknowledgement without commentary, emphasizing that accountability began with awareness and that the purpose of the framework was always protection through understanding, not compliance through fear. The narrator notes that Daniel's perspective on authority shifted in that moment, from something conferred by uniform to something earned through comprehension. He realized that the power Alana held was not visible, not announced, but embedded in the very rules he had enforced. The conversation had reached its reveal, not as a dramatic unveiling, but as an inevitable conclusion. Daniel stood facing the architect of the system he thought he commanded, understanding now that true authority resided not in enforcing rules, but in knowing why they existed and how easily they could be violated when that knowledge was absent. The aftermath unfolded without spectacle, guided by process rather than emotion, as Daniel Cross adjusted to the new reality with deliberate care. He asked what came next, not defensively, but with a measured acceptance that signaled readiness to learn. Alana Brooks explained that alignment required documentation and review, not as punishment, but as restoration of intent. She described how observations were recorded, how discrepancies between application and design were traced, and how corrective pathways were determined by patterns rather than isolated moments. Daniel listened, recognizing that the system he had trusted was now engaging him with the same rigor it applied to any variable that drifted from specification. The narrator observes that this was karma without drama, accountability without humiliation. Alana clarified that the immediate priority was clarity, ensuring that the framework's purpose was re-established before any decisions were finalized. Daniel acknowledged this, noting that his earlier certainty had narrowed his perspective. He asked whether his actions constituted a violation under the framework as designed. Alana responded that violations were assessed by impact and understanding, and that the current review would focus on how interpretation diverged from intent. She emphasized that the goal was not to assign blame, but to prevent recurrence by closing knowledge gaps. Daniel felt a quiet relief at the fairness of the approach, paired with a sober recognition of responsibility. The narrator highlights that authority had shifted from command to coherence, from enforcement to understanding. Alana outlined the steps of the review process, explaining how facilitators convened to evaluate alignment, how training records were examined for completeness, and how updated instruction was delivered where needed. Daniel noted the precision of the system, seeing for the first time how carefully the framework protected both the public and those tasked with applying it. He asked whether the process would involve his leadership. Alana answered that transparency was essential and that leadership participation ensured institutional learning rather than individual isolation. Daniel accepted this, understanding that growth required visibility. The conversation remained calm, grounded in shared objectives rather than opposition. Alana spoke about recalibration sessions designed to rebuild confidence through comprehension, emphasizing that understanding restored trust more effectively than discipline alone. Daniel recognized the wisdom in that, recalling moments when compliance had felt hollow without context. The narrator underscores that this phase represented the true consequence, not a reprimand, but a re-education that realigned practice with principle. Daniel expressed willingness to participate fully, acknowledging that his role demanded more than procedural fluency. Alana affirmed that willingness, noting that accountability began with openness. She reiterated that the framework existed to guide judgment, not replace it, and that its strength depended on those who applied it understanding why each element existed. Daniel felt the weight of that responsibility settle into resolve rather than resistance. As the process moved forward, the environment remained unchanged, yet the dynamic had transformed completely. The power that once felt unilateral now operated through structure and purpose. The narrator concludes that karma, in this instance, arrived as clarity, reshaping certainty into comprehension and reinforcing that justice within systems is sustained not by force, but by fidelity to understanding. The resolution did not arrive with announcement or applause, but with a quiet realignment that lingered long after the conversation concluded. Daniel Cross stood in the same place where his certainty had first taken shape, now aware that understanding had replaced it with something sturdier. Alana Brooks remained composed, her role complete not because authority had been asserted, but because alignment had been restored. Daniel reflected on the path that led here, recognizing that the system he trusted had never intended to shield ignorance, only to guide judgment. He acknowledged in measured words that his confidence had outpaced his comprehension, and that such imbalance carried consequences even when intentions were sound. Alana received this acknowledgement as she had received every other moment in the exchange, without embellishment, affirming that growth within systems depended.
On such recognition, the narrator observes that the environment did not change, yet the meaning of authority within it had transformed. Daniel understood now that power derived from knowledge, not posture, and that the framework he enforced demanded humility as much as discipline. He considered how often he had relied on memorization, mistaking familiarity for mastery, and how easily that habit could obscure the purpose behind rules designed to protect. Alana spoke briefly about continuity, about how frameworks lived or failed through those who applied them, and how the responsibility to understand them fully was ongoing. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle not as burden, but as obligation he was prepared to meet. The narrator underscores that this was the true justice of the moment. Not a reversal meant to humiliate, but a correction that elevated understanding above assumption. Daniel resolved to engage with the review process fully, to approach recalibration not as a remedial measure, but as an opportunity to align practice with principle. Alana concluded that such alignment was the quiet work that sustained trust, especially in moments when pressure threatened clarity. Their exchange ended without ceremony, each stepping away with a shared recognition that systems functioned best when those within them understood their foundations. Daniel watched as Alana departed, not as a figure of dominance, but as the architect whose work had guided countless decisions unseen. He realized that her authority had never needed display. It existed in the coherence of the framework itself. The narrator reflects that the lesson extended beyond a single interaction, illustrating how justice within institutions emerged not from confrontation, but from fidelity to understanding. Daniel carried that lesson forward, aware that future decisions would demand not only adherence, but insight. He recognized that true compliance began where curiosity replaced defensiveness, and where responsibility included the courage to question one's own certainty. As the moment faded into routine, its impact remained, reshaping Daniel's approach to his role and redefining his relationship with the rules he once recited without reflection. The story closes not with triumph or defeat, but with a quiet truth made clear. He enforced rules he never fully understood, and she did not need to raise her voice to remind him that she had written them.